Hello, James Ernest of the Grueling Truth Radio Network. Today is celebrating March and Women's History Month. With me is author Lydia Reeder. Lydia, could you tell us a little bit about your book?
Sure. It's called Dust Bowl Girls, the inspirational story of the team that barnstormed its way to basketball glory. And it takes place back in the 1930s and is an epic sports story about a team of teenage farm girls led by a tough basketball coach who unexpectedly start winning game after game and make it to the 1932 national championships, where they face an epic showdown with a team called the Dallas Golden Cyclones and their best athlete, the famous Olympic star and eventually became golfer, Babb. They were known as the Oklahoma Presbyterian College Cardinals.
What team nowadays would remind you of the Cardinals?
You know, I really can't compare them to a current team. It was so different back then. They were a completely self-funded basketball team. They played by half-court basketball rules, which were called girls' rules back then. Mm-hmm. 6-on-6 basketball, where they had 3 forwards and 3 guards, and the forward stayed on one side, the guard stayed on the other, and they never crossed the center line. So they became excellent at passing. So it was a very interesting type of game back then, and a little more scrappy than it is today.
Exactly. They let them play more, less fouls, that kind of thing, I'm guessing.
Exactly.
How would you compare your book to, say, A League of Their Own?
Well, A League of Their Own takes place in the 1940s, so times were a little different then. The war was going on, but the economy had actually gotten a lot better. In 1931, when the story starts out, the Great Depression is just starting to really gain momentum, and poverty is becoming desperate among especially the rural areas of Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas, Arkansas, other states like that. So in the midst of this Great Depression and then the Dust Bowl that happened in certain parts of the country, this little team of women basketball players just suddenly become inspirational heroes by beating some of the best women's basketball teams in the country.
You mentioned how they beat the best teams and all. What did they have, like an 89-game win streak, something like that?
Right. They were together for 3 years until the school had to close down because of hard financial times. And they won 89 consecutive games. The book takes place during that first year that they were just starting out, and they were, like I said, they were all teenagers. The youngest was 16. I think the oldest was 20.
So with the tournament back then, the AAU tournament, was it mostly colleges like them, or was it kind of a mix?
Actually, most colleges did not have competitive women's basketball teams back then. There was a movement going on to eliminate competitive athletics for women, especially at the college and university level. So the Amateur Athletic Union oversaw the competitive sports that took place in the Industrial League. They called it the Industrial League back then. So most of the teams that played were sponsored by companies like oil companies or shoe companies or insurance companies, and they had actually a lot more funding than the Oklahoma Presbyterian Cardinals did. So that was a big difference back then. Plus, the people that played for the industrial league teams had been together for a long time, unlike the Cardinals, who had just started playing together.
Okay, so their amount of time together was part of the being the underdog, and then I guess the other part would be like you mentioned in the book about how they had to leave home and kind of being in a new place. Is that part of it?
For most of them, that was the first time they had been away from home ever without their parents. So there was a lot of, homesick girls at first. The older girls, one of the main players' name is Doll Harris. She was a sophomore that year, and she was pretty hard on the freshmen. She had established herself as an excellent basketball player the year before, and she kind of became like an assistant coach to Sam Babb, the coach, and helped keep the girls in line. But they were all very young and were basically schoolgirls.
You mentioned Sam. Was he the inspiration for writing the story due to the...
Sure. Sam Babb, the coach, was my great-uncle. I never knew him because he died quite young, but he was my grandmother's favorite brother. And she campaigned in the late 1970s to get him inducted into the Oklahoma Sports Hall of Fame. His achievements had been lost to history. And sure enough, in 1979, he was inducted. To get him inducted, she collected a lot of information, old newspaper articles, letters from his players, photographs, all kinds of information that she... After he was inducted, stored in a folder and filed away. And years later, she handed that folder to me and told me that I might want to write about them someday. And sure enough, once I pulled that folder out and started looking at it, I realized that there was quite a story here.
So do you have any of the casting ideals already? Because every review I read says this needs to be a movie.
Well, it's very cinematic. At one point, they travel around on an old crank start bus that keeps breaking down in order to go barnstorm and play all the games. And I don't... Writing it, since it was a true story, I didn't really have anybody in mind, except when I would ask my relatives about who had known Sam, what he was like, they would say, well, he was like Spencer Tracy. So even though Spencer Tracy's not around anymore, that's sort of the ideal that inspired Sam in a way.
So you mentioned about how people were trying to eliminate women's sports. Who was one of the main antagonist in the book?
Sure. Well, there was formed by the federal government an organization called the Women's Division of the National Amateur Athletics Federation. It oversaw women's athletics, and it was, and Mrs. Herbert Hoover was appointed to head up that organization. She had previously been head of the Girl Scouts, so they brought her over to organize it. And part of the reason they started the organization was that women were gaining a competitive edge. Back then, they were becoming very good at playing basketball and softball and running track and field, and it sort of frightened a certain amount of people who maintained the cultural norms because women had never done that before, and some of them were afraid that competitive sports, especially basketball, would demoralize and debilitate young women. So Mrs. Hoover and the other members of the women's division systematically began a campaign to eliminate competitive athletics for women. And they did, for the most part, at the university and college level. But the other organization, the AAU, that sponsored competitive athletics, was very powerful. And they, as long as they were around, women did have a means of competing because they also sponsored track and field and took a group of women to the 1932 Olympics. So it was quite a battle between those two organizations about women's competitive sports.
The way it sounds, Babe kind of comes off a lot like, I don't want to say Conor McGregor because that's a little harsh, or Floyd Mayweather, but she does come off a bit boastful in her things.
She was quite a boastful character. She was very competitive, but she was at the time, she was just starting out too, and she was about the same age as the teenagers in the Cardinal team. And she had come from a very poor background. Her father was a poor tenant farmer in Texas, and she was recruited by the Golden Cyclones, and she actually started making money, and she would send that money back home. So she found a way to promote herself, and to a lot of people back then, that seemed like she was being boastful, but she was actually very smartly getting herself in the newspapers so that she could demand a little bit more money and actually help her family back home. So it was very interesting. She was dragged through the newspapers. Her name, she was often called mannish, which was a terrible way of describing a woman back then, not ladylike. And so she stood up to those people, and that may have made her come off as boastful.
Let's see. With your book, I know they got some weird rules in the NCAA, but I think this is one of those ones that the athletes, especially the women athletes, need an opportunity to be able to read. Would you be interested in doing like a book tour to different colleges so they can, learn more about the history?
Oh, that's very interesting. Right now, I'm going to bookstores. I live in Denver, Colorado, and in Oklahoma City, and Kansas and Missouri. It just came out about a month ago, and I've been very encouraged. People seem to be very interested, and especially a lot of older women who played basketball back then. They remember what it was like.
Yeah, because this seems like something, the NCAA needs to, next NCAA women's tournament, obviously this year would be kind of hard to, get it all together at the last minute, but next year have this as part of a theme of, celebrating how far women have come in sports. Oh,
I think that's an excellent idea, because a lot of women today still suffer from being called too masculine. So I think we should honor the pioneers of women's athletics.
Exactly. I mean, the WNBA just celebrated its 20th season, and obviously, if it wasn't for teams like this, there might not have ever been a WNBA.
That and Title IX, which changed everything. And when the NCAA started organizing women's sports, then it just skyrocketed. And now, millions of people watch women compete every year, and it's just gaining momentum all the time.
Exactly. Like I've had the privilege of covering 3 of the local teams here in Cincinnati, Cincinnati, Xavier, and Northern Kentucky, but also got down to the UK game and seeing UConn and their 100-game win streak kind of reminds me when I was reading the book, obviously not the same, type of players, because UConns are just ridiculously talented, so they definitely would never be accused of being an underdog unless they play.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Once they play the dream team, other than that, it's going to be tough for them to not be the favorite. But yeah, it's just amazing.
Oh, everybody's going to be gunning for them. That's just the way it is.
Exactly. And then, it's just unbelievable how they've been able to excel, because they've even played the number 2 team in the country, and I think they beat them by 15. They played Ohio State, which is remarkable, and they played South Carolina, who has 2 young ladies who should definitely be in the WNBA next year and the following year, and beat them substantially. So, yeah, it'll be, interesting to see the margin of victory in this tournament this year, because, wow, I mean, I can't imagine anybody could beat them. If they did, it would be the miracle on ice, if not better.
Yeah, and back when the Cardinals were playing, they were never the first year they were never considered unbeatable. They were always the underdog because they kind of came out of nowhere. And even as they kept going and winning games, they didn't. Sometimes they won by substantial margins, but when the good teams played, sometimes it came down to the last few minutes as to who would win, and it could be quite exciting.
Definitely. Yeah, I was going to say, with having a women's studies background, yeah, this would definitely make an interesting venture into, like you mentioned, Title IX. And unfortunately, Title IX tends to get a bad rap. Because growing up, the only thing I knew about Title IX was it was the reason why we no longer had wrestling at school. But it turned out that was some BS they were selling us, where it was they just didn't want to pay for the women's sports, so instead of paying more
they used it as an excuse.
Exactly. Yeah, because like Miami of Ohio used to have a team, and then because of rulings and whatnot, they could no longer count their ice performers, which seemed odd to begin with because I didn't know any other schools had ice performers. But yeah, that one, yeah, they're like, yeah, we have 100 and something ice skating team. Really? No one talks about that? That sounds pretty cool. Because how do you fit 100 and something people on the rink at one time? The logistics make it worth its while.
Uh-huh.
So, wanted to ask you about the players. You mentioned the one young lady, how she was more of a leader. Who were more of the jokesters on the team, or were they all pretty serious?
Well, they were all serious students, but there were they were called the Dunford twins. They were Lara and Vera Dunford, and they were 6 feet tall, and they had flaming red hair, and they were always telling jokes or defending each other's honor to the death. But they were also really good basketball players, and I happened to be able to meet them. They were still living when I started the research, and I think they were exactly the same in their 80s as they were when they were teenagers, just fun-loving and very fun to be around.
So they would probably be the Rosie O'Donnell and Madonna characters in the...
They would think so. They actually went on to play for a barnstorming team.
The Redheads?
The Redheads. And
wow.
the story goes that when they first started out, they weren't called the Redheads. But all the women players, they were great players, and they would play men's teams, and they definitely were an exhibition team. They decided that all the players would dye their hair red to match Lara and Vera's red hair, and that's how they started out as the All-American Redheads.
Nice.
And that was one of the stories that they told me, and I thought, what a fantastic story. And even after the twins left the team, they kept dyeing their hair red and were known as the All-American Redheads. Yeah,
because they played together for a long amount of time, right? About 50 years?
Oh, gosh, yeah. I think they were around recently, and they were all great basketball players.
Yeah, it made me think of the Globetrotters, especially because of the uniforms.
They were just like that.
Yeah.
They were showy. They would do the drills like the Globetrotters did. That's a good comparison.
Excellent. Yeah, because fortunately I got to interview one of the Globetrotters earlier this year, and yeah, it has a lot of similarities to them, and yeah, I mean, it's one of those stories that unfortunately, like you said, like the Cardinals, not enough people know about them.
Right. And they were the other pioneers. I mean, really and truly, they, and I'm sure they are in the Hall of Fame.
Excellent. Let's see. One of the last ones is the beauty pageant at halftime. Wow, that is, yeah.
Yeah, the national tournament, at the national basketball tournament for women, the AAU would sponsor a beauty pageant. They would also have free throw contests and other skills contests. But since competitive athletics for women were always questioned about being ladylike, and having to meet the cultural norms for ladylike behavior, the AAU decided that they would sponsor a beauty contest to let everyone know that these women were women. And it was very interesting because the players just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said that everybody took it as an everyday occurrence. They didn't have to compete in it if they didn't want to, but every team chose its most beautiful player, and then the tournament would award them with this giant tournament award that was almost as big as the ones that the winners got. So it was very, it was kind of like a carnival type atmosphere.
Okay. So, yeah, like like a carnival, like a fair where they have multiple...
Like a fair.
Yeah, like there's multiple events, and they kept each event separate, so it wasn't like a cumulative event, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I would hate to, see the basketball score, oh, you get an extra 20 points at the end of the game because of... Okay,
no.
That makes more sense now.
No, it was all well organized and definitely held so that they would, draw the most, biggest crowds.
Excellent. And then I want to put in for my part in the movie the drugstore crowd. That sounds quite interesting. Yeah,
that was a great scene, and that was actually a newspaper article. And I'm sure that it was lots of fun to sit in that drugstore and wait for the next phone call to see what was happening.
Yeah, because nowadays, and just so the fans could understand it, because nowadays, the same score that's going on at the event on your cell phone because it updates constantly. But back then, didn't even have the radio covering the game half the time. So wow, that would be quite interesting.
Right, and they received phone calls probably from the sports writer from the newspaper that was at the game. So they would call in, every so often and give them the play-by-play, and then someone in the drugstore would let everyone know what was going on.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely, that just screams out to be a scene, because that would be perfect.
It does.
Let's see, the last question, what are you working on nowadays? Obviously you're doing the tour to, promote the book, but do you have any ideals for a follow-up?
Oh, I have a few things in mind, but nothing's taken hook. I've been really busy doing promotion for the book.
Excellent. Are you planning on sticking in the sports genre, or the more history-based, or the combination thereof, like you did with this book?
I love the idea of writing about everyday heroes, and it doesn't have to be in sports. It can be anywhere. So that's kind of my niche, and that's what I would like to keep doing. But it doesn't have to be sports. It can be anything, but I love history.
Excellent. So, going through history, finding those unsung heroes, and shining the light on them. Excellent.
Yes.
Sounds
That's exactly
great.
it.
Well, I appreciate your time, Lydia. And we're going to put this up on the Grueling Truth Radio Network sometime in March. That way we can get the word out there and celebrate Women's History Month.
Exactly. Well, thanks very much.